My name is Christian Bell. I coordinate public programs here at the History Center Museum, and it is amazing to see not only so many guests, but so many dolls as well. And we do seem to have enough room if people want to give their doll their own seat. We definitely have room for that today. And you may be thinking, well, he's not the most appropriate person to introduce our speaker today. You're absolutely right. Fortunately, I have many colleagues here at the History Center who are deeply entrenched in the world of American Girl fandom, some of whom are here today. And so it gives me great pleasure to introduce one of my colleagues, Allison Swanson, program specialist here at Minnesota Historical Society. So Allison, come on up.
Hi all, my name is Allison Swanson and I'm a program specialist here at the Minnesota Historical Society where I've been working for about 10 years. And this is Kirsten Larson, who's been with me for about 30 years. Christian asked me to introduce the speaker today. He felt that someone who had a few more lived experiences might be a bit more appropriate. But my problem when I tried to think of an appropriate anecdote is that I had too many. American Girl, the dolls, the books, the curated catalogs touched huge parts of my childhood. They not only connected me with the girls of the past, but also the girls and the women in my own life. My grandmother was the same age as Molly. My mom, a 4-H girl to the core, made dresses for my American Girl, read me the books when I was sick, and we discovered historic foods together. My neighbor, Lydia, who coincidentally also had Kirsten, like many Minnesota girls, we got matching velvet coats made by another neighbor of ours. My cousin Samantha, you can guess who she had, played together, and eventually we would pass on a lot of our clothes and accessories to our younger cousins and their dolls. And this connection didn't just stay in the past. In the last few weeks, I've learned about a lot of my colleagues who also felt that their American Girl dolls and experiences were their gateway into working in the historic field. From learning about cholera and mashed turnips to historic clothes and toys and food. One colleague my age talked about how she saved every penny to afford her own Kirsten in the 90s. And I talked to another colleague who's at least a decade younger than me, who crafted time travel play with her friends to get the 70s doll and the 30s doll and the colonial doll all in a room together to play. And a lot of those came long after I aged out of American Girl. So from all of us working at the Historical Society, in large part inspired by American Girl, I'm so happy to introduce our speaker today. Mary Mahoney is a historian, a podcaster, writer, and cultural critic. She's the co-host of the podcast Dolls of Our Lives, which talks about each of the American Girl books, what they say about those historical areas, and the time they were written in, the 80s and 90s. She's a lover of historic house museums. We at MNHS can recommend a few. And lives with her wife in Connecticut. In 2023, she and her co-host Allison Horrocks published a book, Dolls of Our Lives, Why We Can't Quit American Girl, which explores how this brand got to be so important to all of our lives. Please join me and Kirsten in welcoming Mary Mahoney.
Thank you so much. I'm actually the shortest person here, sorry. Thank you for that generous introduction. I'm so happy to meet some of your colleagues. I'm sure I'll meet more of them. And, you know, I do believe you love working with them, even though you did just share privately that your favorite colleague is a horse. Thinking of all the other human colleagues you have at this time. I'm so delighted to have been invited here to help introduce, in some way, the Girlhood It's Complicated exhibit upstairs, which I hope people have had a chance to see or will see after this. And that exhibit explores, among other things, how powerful the history of girlhood is and dynamic, and it focuses on things like friends and family and work and school. And speaking of work, I do want to thank everyone here at Minnesota Historical Society who made today happen, as I'm sure anyone here who has planned a party, American Girl themed or otherwise, knows. You know, planning a social event takes a lot of work. That's some of it seen, some of it not seen. So with that in mind, I do want to thank Christian Bell, Chris White, Allison, Lisa, and Jeff from Veritext, and Megan here today. So thank you all for all of your hard work. Now, the thing about girlhood is it's also complicated. And it's not just me saying that. And if you want to use this QR code, you can find a link to my newsletter, which is on pop culture and history, where I write about American Girl and many other things, including historians like Charlie XCX, who said, "Girl, it's so confusing sometimes to be a girl." And she's not wrong. And when I think about how complicated girlhood can be, I know for me, the thing I keep coming back to is American Girl. Now, I'm as old as American Girl. I'm as old as American Girl. I was born in 1986. And I know this is controversial to say in Kirsten territory, but I do identify as a Molly. Please do not hold that against me. Thank you. Thank you. I'm glad this is a safe space. But in thinking about the things that make girlhood so magical and wonderful and complicated, I think American Girl is really a great invitation to think about all of these things. So in my time this afternoon, I really want to take you on a journey, as they would say in The Bachelor, through the history of not only girlhood, but of American Girl. And I'll just say right now, the main point I want to make is that we still really desperately need strong stories for girls, and stories that are complicated and empowering, and that's why I think we still need American Girl and things like it. So with that, I want to take us back in time. To quote another historian, Sophia Petrillo, picture it, it's 1984, and a woman named Pleasant has a dream to make a brand that puts girls at the center of the story of American history. Now, how does she do this? How do we get there? If you've been dragged to this talk and you have no idea what American Girl is, this is your moment of the talk. So American Girl began its life as a company called Pleasant Company in 1986 that was designed to both sell dolls that were based on historical characters set in important moments in American history, but also taught them lessons that could apply to life today about things like friendship and family and school. And as they say on their website today, it's about teaching girls about history and who they want to be. Now, in 1986, when Pleasant begins this brand, in one of the first catalogs, she writes a letter to parents in which she says, in part, Pleasant Company will be, quote, a reminder that growing up in America is, has been, and can always be an experience to treasure. Now, there's a lot going on here, and there's a lot going on with Pleasant Rowland, as I'm about to get into, but I want to keep in mind this idea that something that's motivating the brand from the start is the idea that American Girl, that being an American, and an American girl in particular, is an enviable position, that it's a great thing, and it should make you appreciate being an American. So now I want to take us on a little biographical journey, if you'll indulge me. Pleasant Rowland was, as Gwen Stefani might say, just a girl. She was just a girl who became a kindergarten teacher. Then she quit that job and became a TV news anchor in San Francisco in the early 1970s. Now, after this, she will become an educational entrepreneur, first launching a literacy brand. But I want to pause for a moment to think about her moment as a TV news anchor, which is the first time she makes a public interview. Now, this is a profile that appeared of her in 1970 in the San Francisco Examiner. Is it rude to describe someone as hard-boiled or soft? I'll let you decide. But in this sprawling interview that she gives, she's asked to give her opinion on the then, quote, new feminist movement, and this is how she responded. Quote, I am in general agreement with the goals of much of the feminist movement, as I believe most women are. I do feel that women should be given equal treatment at all levels of society, something they do not always have. Newsrooms are notoriously Victorian. What does that mean, Pleasant? But I am opposed to the portions of that movement that de-emphasize the basic femininity of women. The feminist movement defeats itself when it pounds the table and puts on army boots. Now, what do we do with this? Who gets to be a feminist? What kind of girl should we be? I want us to have this quote in the back of our mind when we think about the woman who's driving a brand that in many ways is thinking about what American girls should be like. This is what she thought feminism was. And unironically, I did wear combat boots here today, but it feels like it was the right choice. Now, before we get into when she has what Christy from the Babysitters Club would call her big idea, what was history in pop culture like in the 1980s when pleasant creates pleasant company? So these are some of the most popular history films in the 1980s. Can anyone think for a moment about what these films have in common? The right stuff. What'd you say? Conservatism. Manliness. Mark Zuckerberg would say, I don't see a problem. If you're watching the news, he said last week, the problem with the internet's not masculine enough. Corporate America needs to be more masculine. I agree there's a masculinity crisis in America right now. I don't think that's the problem. But in a similar way, let's think about this for a second. The Right Stuff, which if you've not seen it, it's a story about the space race. Men go to space. Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, about a fake archaeologist who somehow fights the Nazis. And Back to the Future, in which Michael J. Fox returns to his parents' teen years in the 1950s to visit a very nostalgic, rosy 1950s in which things like, for example, segregation don't exist, and in which he's invited at one point to go on a date with his own mom. Now, that is not the subject of my talk today, but I would suggest to the planners here it is worthy of further discussion. But when we think about this, what these things have in common, they are times that they are projects that invite us to go back in time to a mostly white past where men are heroes. Why was this kind of story seductive at this moment? Well, this is after Watergate, it's after the Vietnam War, it's after things like the Rust Belt and the move of jobs either down to the Sun Belt or overseas. The idea of American exceptionalism has taken a major hit. This kind of moment is what allowed someone like Ronald Reagan to emerge and be successful purely by running on the idea that it was him who could make America great again. Pause for a moment of personal nausea. Not at all related to the present. Everything is fine. Everything is fine. But, if you're not a historian, I think that it's really important to ask why we choose to tell the stories of the past that we choose to tell and when we tell them. There is no such thing as objective history, even if you think what you're doing is objective. The questions we ask of the past, the choices we make in storytelling, they're all chosen based on our personal backgrounds and the worlds we find ourselves in. I'll say this again later, but for me, history is not being able to have a great memory. I don't have a great memory. Reciting facts and dates, that's trivia, that's not history. History is organizing our worlds and our place within it. It's the stories we tell about ourselves. So in the 1980s, the stories we chose to tell about ourselves were to make ourselves, knowingly or not, feel better about the state we found ourselves in as a country. Now, Pleasant is both going to upend this, but she's also contributing to it. She wants people to think of America as a great place to live. So she's in part of this narrative, but she's making a major addition to it, which is she's going to put girls at the center of her story. Now, where would you go if you wanted to be inspired with a great business idea when the year is 1984? Yes, the mall. In 1984, she does two things that directly lead to American Girl. First, she goes to a mall to buy a gift for her niece. And she goes to the toy store and has what I would call one of the most fraught interactions with a toy store in human history. She goes to this toy store to buy a doll for her niece, and first she encounters Barbie. Now, any Barbie fans in the house? It's a safe space, it's cool. Pleasant would come for you, I'm sorry. She wouldn't be as kind, because she thought Barbie offered unrealistic expectations of the female body. Barbie was wearing makeup. She was always chasing Ken, even though I'm not really sure if Ken was interested, if you know what I mean. And she was a professional woman. She was a multi-hyphenate. This woman had no time to sleep. She was an astronaut, a president, a teacher, God knows what else, right? She had so much going on, but she was not a child herself. So what kind of fiction of womanhood was Barbie giving girls? Pleasant didn't like it. Teddy Ruxpin. Anyone here of a Teddy Ruxpin doll? Do you know what this is? Okay, great. I also had a Teddy Ruxpin, which terrorized me because it was a teddy bear that had a cassette tape in its back, which you were supposed to use to play tapes that would allow you to listen to a story be read by Teddy Ruxpin. I used mine to play my Janet Jackson cassette. And at one point, it accidentally went on all of its own volition, and I had to watch Teddy Ruxpin sing Control, and I've truthfully never been the same since. But she thought Teddy Ruxpin was overpriced for what it was, and it was not educational enough. And then last but not least, Cabbage Patch Dolls. I love Cabbage Patch Dolls. Am I horrified by the video of them being born, which you can watch on the internet at the museum in Georgia? Yes, I am. But you should absolutely go watch it after leaving this place. But she viewed them as, quote, ugly. She thought they were terrible looking. You should never comment on the looks of a child. Don't tell Pleasant Rowland that. She thought they were ugly. And she thought the neon lights of Toys R Us itself was offensive. She didn't like this place at all. None of the stuff was educational enough. It was either overpriced or it was did not meet the needs of a child. She was very concerned with kids maintaining their innocence, and she didn't like things that Barbie that robbed them of it. The second place she went that year was on a vacation to Colonial Williamsburg. Has anyone here ever been there? Shout out. Yes, I love this place. And we actually went there for the book. It's chapter 2 of the book is focused on Williamsburg because it was so important to her in influencing the brand. Now, if you've not been there, it's a living history museum that imagines it's 1774, and it has living history interpreters who, embody the personas of real people who lived in the time. They do the trades of people in that time, and they teach you about the past through individual storytelling of real people and their lives, and also through the ability to play with objects from the past. Now, when Pleasant was there, they did not have a lot of programming aimed at kids, so these are more recent photos, but you can see someone helping a child play with a spinning wheel. These girls look incredible with their fans. And she had an aha moment there. What if I made something like this for girls that taught them about the past, that made it interesting through individual girls' stories that are based in specific moments in American history, but I also gave them objects to play with that would also help confirm the learning they're doing in the stories that I would tell. So there would be dolls, there would be books, and there would be what I would call accessories, but a museum would call objects. That's how she created American Girl. That's what inspired her. Now, what is the secret sauce that makes American Girl so magical? And it truly is. The girls would not exist without books. So she hired a friend, Valerie Tripp, living legend, to write some of the original books. Every character would have 6 books, and every 6-book series has the same arc. In book 1, we meet them. In book 2, we learn a lesson. In book 3, there's a surprise. Then there's their birthday. Then the Saves the Day book. Book 5 is the most perilous, and I can talk about that. And then book 6 is changes where we kind of signal that they're growing. In the course of these 6 books, they only age 1 year. So we meet them when they're 9, and they stay pretty much 9 the whole time. So they won't be growing up too soon. There will be no makeup like Barbie. There will be no crushes, although we can talk about that. But, so she's correcting the things that she thought were wrong at the mall and adopting the things that she thought were right at Williamsburg. So we have individual stories that girls can latch on to that both teach them about things that are very different from the time that they live in, but also themes that resonate because they feel the same. Like, what's it like to have a fight with your best friend? Or to fight with your sibling, or to figure out that relationship, or bonding with your parents, or going to school, or all of these things that feel ahistorical. And then my favorite part of each book in the back was called A Peek into the Past, where you could actually see the research that went into creating this world that you just read about in the book. When I was a child, thought whoever got to write Peek into the Past had the greatest job in the world, period, full stop. That was my career goal. not exactly viable, but that's what I wanted. And it was amazing to me because we would read these books and then you could see photos from that time period and think, wow, this was really like that girls really lived this way. And, my grandmother, who I love dearly and I'm named after, I would show her pictures from the Molly books, and she was very nonchalant. She'd say, yeah, I had that. Yeah, I had that. Yeah, I had a Victory Garden. And I'd be like, what? Like someone who didn't really talk about herself much. It was such a bridge for us. And that was a big part of her goal, too, that, these books and the dolls would live on and be a bridge for girls with women in their lives, different generations, but then be handed down to their own children. So all of these things together make American Girl such a special thing that was immediately successful upon its release. What's really interesting is the way that she chose to sell them. In many ways, the most enviable object in the world when I was 9 years old was not necessarily an American Girl doll, but the American Girl catalog. I have never had an experience again like this with a catalog in my life. It's incredible. You would get this catalog in the mail and immediately go to work with a pen, circling, annotating, making a budget in the margins. How much would it cost to change my life and get, all of these different things. And they had outfits that you could wear to match your favorite character. But what's so beautiful about this is if you look at the setting of this, it does seem like a museum display, right? You can see the influence of Williamsburg here, all of the objects and the interpretation that we see. I chose Kirsten on purpose. I know where I am. But if you wanted to buy a doll, you had to get the book too. So book 1 came with the doll. Now, it cost you $75 in 1987 to get a hardcover book and a Kirsten doll. Adjusted for inflation today, that would cost you $208. They just reissued Kirsten and are currently selling her with Meet Kirsten for $160. Now, are we supposed to read this as Mattel not being greedy? They could charge $208. I don't know. But I make this point because there is a real financial burden to engaging with American Girl. For many, this is as far as some girls got. And we actually interviewed many fans of American Girl for our book, and many of them said to us, our family couldn't afford American Girl doll, but I loved the catalog. I loved the books that I got from the library. And for some, when they became adults, a sign of their own adulthood when they had their own money was to buy themselves an American Girl doll. And I don't know if that resonates for anybody here, but I just want to acknowledge that this is a big part of this story. As much as she wanted to make these stories accessible, and don't tell Pleasant Rowland the dolls are expensive, she will explode. She doesn't want to hear that. She would say if you bought a Nintendo, that's less educational and about as much money as an American Girl doll and book cost. And she also would once again cite Teddy Ruxpin as someone who can't compare. But just want to acknowledge that's a real part of this story. But let's get into actually the characters she first launched in 1986. So she launches the company with Samantha Parkington, Molly McIntyre, and Kirsten Larson. Now, I know where I am. So I'm not going to talk too much about Samantha or Molly. But I do want to make one point because I feel salty about this. You can look at the 1987 catalog, and these are the illustrations they offer with the descriptions of Molly and Samantha. As you can read, Molly, quote, a schemer and dreamer on the home front during World War II in 1994. Okay. Samantha, a bright Victorian beauty, an orphan raised by her wealthy grandmother in 1904. Okay. Now, why is the story of an orphan seductive? That's a subject for another talk. But I will tell you that at one point, Pleasant went to her niece and said, what kind of stories do you think girls want? When she's in the early stages of production. And the niece said, oh, Aunt Pleasant, orphans. So that may have been part of it. But the point I want to make is this, okay? Why is Samantha a beauty? And I know I'm standing before you as a Molly wearing glasses. But I just want to say this. These dolls are made from the exact same face mold. They have the same face. So What are we doing here? That's just a moment to like shore up the self-esteem of other people in the room besides me. Just want to make that point. History is in the eye of the beholder. But, is this a commentary on girls who wear glasses? I don't know. But these are my descriptions of these characters, like Van Halen. Molly is a model citizen with zero discipline. As an adult, I did have to realize that she's in many ways kind of a sociopath, so I am asking some hard questions about myself and my own alliance with her. And Samantha's in many ways a labor activist queen who has a real white savior complex, but we can, of course, discuss that after the talk. But I do want to spend some time with Kirsten. Now, I will say when we were writing the book and we were doing all these interviews and having listeners write to us all the time, the most vocal, not even a comparison, no one even comes close, the most vocal fans who had things to say unsolicited were Kirsten's. We got letters in which people tried to say they were experts on Kirsten because they were, quote, from Minnesota. Because they were, quote, of Swedish descent. And my all-time favorite, because they, quote, had a mom who worked at IKEA. And, I love the confidence. I just want to stand before you and say that. I love this confidence, especially because I have read these books. I know what she is like. And these are the books that really blew my mind. When we first started the show, we were inspired in part because people made fun of us in our PhD program, and we said that we were inspired to be historians because of American Girl. So in a way that was framed as revenge, but was mostly just something for us to do for fun, when we finished, we decided to reread all the books because we could not remember the plot lines. And the Kirsten books were by far the most surprising books that I reread for reasons I'm about to get into. If you're not familiar with Kirsten's story, she comes from Sweden. She immigrates with her family through Ellis Island to Minnesota. And in the first 20 pages of book 1, we have a child's death from cholera. Her best friend Marta kicks it, R.I.P. Not a lot of time to grieve in this book, lots to do. She settles with her family, who immediately have difficult times, as you would as an immigrant in Minnesota territory in 1850s. They do extract land resources and knowledge from an indigenous friend who was never seen again after book 3. Singing bird, where are you? Don't know. She then goes to school. Her family's in economic peril during a snowstorm. She and her brother find themselves taking cover in a cave where they encounter the dead body of a fur trader, along with his collection of fur pelts, which they then steal because Kirsten basically says to herself, what's he gonna do with them? And in doing so, saves the family. But wait, you think, oh wow, they've really turned the corner here, they're gonna make it. They left Kirsten alone in the log cabin, their home, with a kerosene lamp. And Kirsten invited a raccoon in, who knocked the lamp over, burned the house down. And yet, Kirsten is somehow still a hero and a favorite of so many here. When I landed at your airport, I noticed there was not a Home of Kirsten Larson sign. And I leave you with that mission because one of your greatest characters, for sure. And this is how she's described in that early catalog: a pioneer girl of strength and spirit. Okay. Imagine her life at the edge of America's frontier in a world of wilderness and prairie, of log cabins and one-room schoolhouses, a life of hard work, simple pleasures, and real adventure. Now, I told you before that I think history is really fascinating because it's both a story of a moment in the past that we're curious about and we want to understand, and it's us peering back, trying to understand how people at a specific place and time organize their world and their place within it. How did they understand their lives? What stories did they tell themselves and others about them? But it's also the story of us and the story of the moment in which history is written. And Kirsten's books are really interesting because they're both things. They're stories about the 1850s in Minnesota, but they're also stories about the 1980s in the US and the moment when they were written. So I want to talk about them in both terms. Now, when we think about the 1850s, there is a dead man in an illustration. I'm just putting that out there. But in fairness, Pleasant thought this was cool for 9-year-olds to see in 1986, so just going to say that. If anyone's struggling, I feel for you. I'm struggling too. But I want to talk for a second about what they say, what they can tell us about the 1850s. One is that childhood was incredibly difficult. That's accurate. You know, the idea of being a child and having that be a protected time of innocence with no labor does not exist ever for some children, but certainly not in popular culture until the 20th century. So if you were a child in the 1850s, you'd be expected to be a laborer for your family. You were integral to their survival, and everything was reliant on that. So yes, she did go to school, and I think the depiction of a one-room schoolhouse is really fascinating in these books to show that there was some attempt at offering education. But when you read the books, you have to wonder how long would she have been allowed to go to school when her family needed her desperately to, I guess, burn their house down. So that's a real question. I also think it gets right how difficult the immigrant experience was as someone who was not an English speaker to come to this country, to learn about how to be an American, you know, all of these things, in addition to learning just how to be a person, how to be a girl in 1854, really complicated. And I think it does a really beautiful job telling that story. The things that I think are revelatory about the 1980s that you see in these books are how it imagines the frontier and this idea of the frontier, and specifically seeing it from a purely white person's perspective in which everything you meet, people, resources, is meant to be in support of your survival at all costs. When I was growing up, I played the Oregon Trail computer game. Did anyone else here play that? Yes, and if you go on the internetarchive.org, you can actually play it on their site. They've preserved it, so please go do that. It's endless fun. But the premise of that game is that you're given a set amount of money, which you must apportion between food and goods, and based on your choices, that will lead to your own survival, or in my case, fording the river and dying, or dysentery, or many things that killed me within the game that you could not foresee. But when you play the game, it's from a white person's perspective. There are no indigenous people, and you don't encounter things like, do I have the right to this land? Never comes up. The things that you have to fight are the elements, not discounting that, that's real. But thinking about the stories people tell in this period, I think you can see a lot of commonalities. The Little House on the Prairie TV show from the 1970s, which I love. Love seeing people in the 1870s with 1970s shag haircuts. Talk about stories colliding. But even in Little House on the Prairie, infamously, you know, the treatment of indigenous people is not great. And I think that you can see a through line from that to things like Dances with Wolves, which is actually from 1991, where Kevin Costner is the hero in that movie and attempts to save an indigenous tribe from removal. Spoiler alert, he does not. But we can think about how all of these stories are arriving at the same time and having these common elements, and how we can see them in Kirsten's books as well. That no one in Kirsten's family ever wonders about their right to the land. They're so desperate for survival, it's their first thought. They're not thinking about settler colonialism or things that we might think of if we were rewriting these books today, right? So you can kind of see that in the story. But I also think what it tells us about the 1980s is a story about immigration in the 1980s and how that's changed in our country. It's interesting, a lot of women wrote to us and said Kirsten was so important to them because they themselves had been immigrants to our country as children from all over the world, and often did not identify as white. So as people of color, still seeing Kirsten as someone who resonated with them because of this immigration story. And in the 1980s, we do see the profile of immigrants to our country having changed quite a bit as a result of laws passed in the 1960s that removed racial quotas and instead replaced them with family ties and labor skills as the reasons that determine immigration. So we can see that bearing fruit in the 80s that both inspires people of color to resonate with Kirsten as an immigrant, but also changes the picture of immigration in our country from being so white. So it's interesting to kind of see those books in this regard. It also reminds us, too, that Pleasant was driven by a desire to show it was always amazing to grow up in America. But for that to be true, you have to be part of a group for whom it's amazing. So that's continues to be true, but something just to think about. Now, I want to transition away from Kirsten, sadly. We can absolutely talk more about her later, but I want to note that by the end of the 1980s and early 1990s, Pleasant was expanding her brand to think not just about telling stories based in the past, but about how to provide resources and materials for girls in the 1990s. She was entering what I might call her goop era. She was creating a lifestyle brand. And some of the products that she created to really grow that part of her world were American Girl magazine. I'm not sure if anyone here is familiar with that. Yes. Apart from the books, my absolute favorite thing American Girl ever made was the magazine. In part because it never had models on the cover. They were real girls. They told stories about girls from all over the country who had really interesting lives. And they also had a really primal advice section called Heart to Heart, where real girls could write in response to questions like, do you need a best friend? And things got really vulnerable really fast. There was also an advice section in the back called Help! In which girls would write in complaining about their parents, and then their parents would then have to mail these letters for them to American Girl. But it's such a beautiful publication. I can't think of something that's comparable today. And one of the things I think is quietly radical about the magazine is that it had paper dolls in it. So if you were a reader, you could submit yourself, and you would send in images of women in your family, and artists would draw outfits based on your family photos. And if none existed, they would do research and create outfits that were historically appropriate. And a girl could actually tell the history of her story matrilineally through paper dolls, which is actually really radical. Most family history is not told through the woman's line. So in a way, this is such an incredible thing. This is the first paper doll, Courtney Price. She's a celebrity to me. But I think it's incredible, and I love these paper dolls. They also had stores starting in 1998, and they expanded the dolls that were offered to include girls who looked like you. That may sound like eugenics, but it was a way to expand the brand and actually make it more inclusive, because the only doll of color at that point was Addie, who is a self-liberated, formerly enslaved girl who navigates freedom in Philadelphia with her family. So, thinking of it in that regard, it was actually a very inclusive move. So the brand still at that point had historical characters whose stories speak to different historical moments and the present. And it invites us, I think, to think about the ways in which history is a story of progress, but sometimes it's more complicated than that. A lot of times people like to think about history like this, like things are always getting better, technology is always improving. But if you think about something like AI, yes, that is technology that's improving or showing new developments, but is it also not more complicated for issues like privacy? Is it an improvement? Just a thought, we don't have to get into AI today. But to talk about this idea of complicated history, I want to talk about Julie Albright. In part because the exhibit upstairs has a really cool section on Minnesota and its history of women's basketball. I'm a huge women's basketball fan, so that's also partially why I'm very invested in Julie. But Julie is a really interesting character because she's the first character American Girl ever made that was the child of divorce, which is kind of incredible that she came out in 2007 because so many children grow up with divorced parents, but it's really beautiful that they have these books as models of how to navigate what can be a really tough time. So it kind of shows how the books are exploring a historical moment, but also offering themes that are really resonant with girls today. Now, Julie in 1974 really benefits from Title IX, which prevents discrimination based on sex for institutions that receive federal funding. This is important for Julie because she loves basketball, and she desperately wants to join her school's basketball team. And her basketball coach / PE teacher is frankly a tool and isn't on board, makes her jump through a million hoops, including signing a petition, and she gets it done. And she gets it done in part with the help of a Vietnam vet friend, ? Why is a 9-year-old hanging out alone with a Vietnam vet? Why is he quoting Richard Nixon as an inspiration? I don't have answers. There are some historical questions for which we will have no answers, and that's one of them. But by having him in the books, I think you can also see this as a moment that's trying to speak to the complexity of the time. I actually think the most interesting plotline is about her mom, who opens a very interesting upcycling fashion boutique, where she will take used jeans and create a purse and things like this. But when you think about her stepping out on her own, which, like, go off, queen, I hope your business succeeds, she's able to do this in part because she's benefiting from things like the Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974, which allowed women to have bank accounts in their own names, or apply for credit cards in their own names, or have credit history that accrued just to them and not their husband, for example. This was a major, major shift in how women could interact with financial institutions, and in many cases, like Julie's mom, start their own businesses. So to see her be divorced, but also thriving as a small business owner, it's like, wow, thank you, American Girl. Like, you really led us to this moment about women's equality. But, I will return you to the quote I read before of Pleasant's thoughts about the feminist movement. We must still be feminine, no combat boots. So it's interesting to tell you that in the Julie books, all 6 of them, the word feminism never comes up. So we have this woman's story where she is really embodying a lot of the changes that feminists and activists are pushing for in this time and get done. But in the peek into the past, where we get history of the time period, no reference to the women's movement, no reference to feminism. And I think that's in part how you can see the books trying to maintain a line that they are, quote, not political, which in my mind is impossible, because the choice to not talk about it is political. Also interesting to note, she lives in San Francisco, and Julie, in 1974, never meets a gay person. Incredible. Incredible. It's what a gay person, calls a dare to be straight situation. But that's a choice as well, right? To not talk about that, to not feature that. And to even have the Vietnam vet quote Richard Nixon and no one else is an interesting choice. But I invite you to think this way about the pop culture that you love. Think about the choices people make. What story are they telling? What story could they have told instead? And it will tell you a lot about the time period that you're interested in our own time. I do want to briefly talk about basketball because, again, I am a huge fan. But in 1974, that's the first year a woman gets a full ride to college on a basketball scholarship. So Ann Myers, going to UCLA. She's been a long-time commentator for the Phoenix Mercury. But it's not that long ago that a woman got a full scholarship to play basketball. That's mind-blowing to me. In 1976, women's basketball was added to the Olympics. The WNBA was founded in 1996. The University of Minnesota had a team in 1982. My wife went to Smith College, so she'll never let me forget that women's basketball was first played at Smith College in 1893. So she's not here today, but that slide's for her. And when we think about progress, in April 2024, the Iowa-UConn women's Final Four game had the highest ratings of any basketball game in ESPN history, with 17 million viewers. So in the span of a few decades, it went from not being funded at institutions of higher ed or in schools like Julie's to being the most watched basketball game on ESPN. And yet, when I talk about progress being complicated, how much are women basketball players paid compared to men? I'm not going to tell you the number because it's just going to make everyone too sad. Can't do it. And I have to acknowledge, I'm here in the home of the Lynx. Respect to you. I'm a huge UConn fan, so I'm bringing you this from my own personal lens, which is that I'm obsessed with Maya Moore. I think she's one of the greatest basketball players of all time. Lindsay Whalen, who's featured in the exhibit upstairs. Sylvia Fowles, who retired and became a funeral director. Get into it. And then Paige Beckers, who I think is arguably going to be the #1 pick in the WNBA draft, who just dropped her own sneaker. She's the first women's basketball player to have a sneaker deal. Are these sneakers cute? I'm not going to comment on that. And I'm a huge sneaker person. But I love this for her. She also started a food bank in Minneapolis, and I think that's insanely cool. And people who have endorsement deals, that's what you should do with your money. Anyway, so your state has incredible history of women's basketball, but keeping in mind the incredible progress in this sport, it's important to note that in a few years into the WNBA on ESPN, this channel that had the most watched basketball game, Bill Simmons wrote an op-ed in which he said the WNBA can't be successful because women don't look sexy when they play basketball. Thank you. Imagine if this crowd had been like, yeah, he has a point. What would I have done? Oof, tough moment for me. But yeah, I mean, has anyone ever said, I really love that LeBron James because he's so hot when he plays? I mean, no judgment if that's how you feel, but no one is assessing men's basketball or its watchability on those terms. And in a sense, it's the same trap that Pleasant found herself in, wanting women's rights, but only if we maintain the appearance that's attractive to other people. So that's where seeing history as a story of progress is really complicated because, women are not being judged on the same terms or measured on the same terms. And I think that's all the more reason why we need stories for girls that are empowering about sports and about everything else. And why I was so delighted to see Lila, the doll of the year from last year, I believe, who's a gymnast from St. Paul. Shout out to St. Paul people here. I'm from Connecticut. We have exactly 0 American Girls based in Connecticut. We do have Gilmore Girls, which is incidentally not based in a real town, but that's another story. But you can see that she's really, I think, based on the story of Suni Lee, also from St. Paul. And I think having these stories are so important for girls because it's really true that if you can see it, you can be it. And having stories where a girl, faces a challenge, there's a whole horse girl plot line that I won't get into, but, facing a challenge and navigating it yourself is so empowering for anybody. And that's a major arc in these books, in all of the American Girl books. And so I think that's one of the reasons why it's so important to have these books. In the time I have remaining, I really want to talk about the stories that we tell about girlhood now. Now, I don't know how old anyone is here. It's none of my business. I don't need to know your alphabet. Your privacy is your own. I will say I'm 38, and I'm the same age as American Girl, and I think about the horror I feel that American Girl has now covered my childhood as a historical era. So they did have a doll named Courtney who was born in 1986 as I was, but these dolls are more my childhood, having come of age in the 90s. Now, can anyone relate to the fashion here of these twins, Isabel and Nikki? And if you go on their website, they've done this incredible thing where they have a virtual imagined room of theirs split down the middle with their different personalities, including a boombox that plays different music each of them likes, one of which is a very good knockoff of the Spice Girls. The other one likes a knockoff of, No Doubt, basically. I'm sure it's the one in the flannel. But it's really interesting to think about, all of the books like to orient the girls' stories around a major national challenge or a big story in the country at that time. So, Molly's stories around World War II, Felicity's around the American Revolution, Courtney's is around the Challenger disaster and the AIDS crisis. Do you want to guess what the challenge is for these two? Y2K. What does that say about us? I don't even know what to say about this. I mean, it's a shock, I'll say that. And having read the books, they also live in Seattle, where there was a huge labor protest called the Battle of Seattle, which they just never noticed. Their dad owns a coffee shop. They just never noticed it. Didn't really affect them. They were too busy planning for Y2K. But, I want to use this as a jumping off point for people my age or thereabouts to think about, if you were going to write the history of your own girlhood, if you were going to tell your own story American Girl style, oftentimes you have to pair these national stories with personal stories. So what would be the national stories that you would choose to define your girlhood? When I think about this era, instead of Y2K, they could have focused on things like the rise of personal computers or the internet. Even boy bands. Nothing has done more to girlhood than the rise of the wars between Backstreet Boys and NSYNC fans, or the Spice Girls, the second British invasion that I really care about. Or even thinking about school shootings like Columbine or 9/11. These are huge national stories. How would you tell them, or how do they live inside the story of your own girlhood? But then thinking about personal stories. Things like the things happening in your family or school or playing sports or friends. These are the things that define our lives. If you look at the diaries and the holdings here at the archive, you might notice that if you're reading about the Civil War, people aren't talking about it. And that might be surprising to you. But, if you think about our lives now, we're not talking about national news all the time with our family or in our diaries. We're talking about, geez, I hope my son figures out this thing at school or whatever's on your mind. So it's those personal stories that really capture so much. And when we think about girls today, think about what you would use to capture your own stories about the things that make you feel like yourself. Would it be drawings that you've done, conversations with a grandparent, social media posts, your Gmail inbox, terrifying thought for some of us. Felicity might have used a sampler. Textiles were such an important archive for girls and for women throughout the past and continue to be. Addie had a diary, and there's even a girl in the exhibit upstairs who had a poodle skirt, which I'm obsessed with. So clothes can be an archive too. History is how we organize our world and our place within it. It's the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves and how we make sense of our lives. It matters, and it matters especially that we continue to tell empowering stories for girls, in part because they so need them. These are the results of a study of girlhood from 2 years ago, and I still find this upsetting to look at. What it revealed is that 39% of girls feel like they belong at school. 57% don't believe they're smart enough for their dream career. 79% feel like they're going to explode from pressure. And 2 in 3 don't speak their mind because they want to be liked. I think it's really hard to be a girl today, to be a child today. Really hard to be a person, let's be real. But it so matters, I think, to have things like American Girl as resources to empower girls now. And American Girl is just one way that we can find empowering stories for girls. That's why I believe that access to libraries are so crucial. Representation in media, and access to historical exhibits like Girlhood, It's Complicated, that show us the girls have always led important, complicated, if not always pleasant, lives. By valuing our past, including American Girl, we can teach girls to feel confident in themselves, their lives, and their own stories. Thank you so much, and I'm happy to take any and all questions people might have.
What are your thoughts on the Be Forever rebrand?
Great question. I mean, I'm happy that they're out of the vault, but I think there's something lost in not offering the 6-book series. So, part of the history I didn't get into is that Pleasant, as much as she hated Barbie, did sell her company to Mattel in 1998 for $750 million. Not a big deal, but I wonder how she navigates that decision, but part of that change has led to changes in how they package items. So she was very insistent on the high quality of the dolls, for example, in the 6-book series, and now they've collapsed those into fewer books, like 2. And I think something's lost in that. I really like the pacing of the 6 books for young readers and letting people absorb kind of the history and the stories they're reading. I do think it's great they're bringing the books back. I wish they had recontextualized them a bit more. Like, for example, the Kirsten books, no offense, but Thinking about Indigenous history, I think they would write those stories differently. Or Felicity's story, in which her family enslaves two people, and yet she is obsessed with liberating, wait for it, a horse. But she's not racist because she has a black friend, okay? So, and that's where you can see the history of the 90s coming out and the telling of that story. But I do think, credit to Valerie Tripp, who wrote that book, I think she would do it differently today. I think she was reflecting the times. It's not giving her a pass. People knew racism was wrong in the 90s. It would have been great if she did, but I would like, if you bring a product back, to recontextualize it and make it appropriate to the time in which it's being reissued. So that's my take.
Did all of the storylines deal with loss, death, or grief for the individual dolls?
That's a great question. No, they did not, but a startling amount of them did. And honestly, something that was interesting rereading them as an adult was just how intense some of the stories are. Samantha's stories are defined by grief. She's lost both of her parents. She's navigating the world without them. And as much as I can joke about her being a labor activist, and she was, although she did invite her poor Irish friend to live in her attic, which is not necessarily the allyship we're looking for. She's living without her parents. And the Josefina books, oh my God, I cried reading those books as an adult because it's about her losing her. We meet her just after she's lost her mother, and her whole family is destroyed. And she's trying to figure out how to move forward and help her family move forward. So a lot of the books are about loss, but not all of them. I mean, the Kit books, which I did not talk about, no one dies. I see a Kit in the crowd. She does spend some time in a hobo village, which is complicated. She wants to be a journalist, more power to her in these times. But so not all the books are about loss. I mean, Molly doesn't lose anyone. She just acts out big time. But that's a good question.
Great. We have a question here in the back.
I'd love to hear your commentary on the warehouse sale that they do in Middleton and what they do with the benefits from that. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I've never been. I've always wanted to go. I'll just sort of out a person in the room right now. My mom made this trip with me. She's here. I'm not going to point her out in the crowd. She's an indoor cat. She's shy. She's a librarian. But I was always far more into the books because my mom's a librarian. I've always loved to read. We read them together. It's a very special part of my childhood. But I did have some dolls that my grandmother gave me. I still don't know where they're located. And I'm not going to shame my mom right now, but they're in your house. Or they're on eBay. That's my conspiracy theory. But I haven't been there. In researching the book, there's incredible articles that you can find coverage of those early sales where women were sleeping in their cars with their daughters, but the night before. And the incredible rush to be there and buy them. And the money itself, I think, was going to a philanthropic cause. I think it was a children's hospital originally. I'm not sure if it still is. But I mean, pleasant to her credit. Yes, she, sold her company for an insane amount of money. She has funded all kinds of philanthropic causes. So, yeah, I mean, I think the hard part with the Mattel sale, going beyond that, the sale in Wisconsin, is the divestment from Wisconsin for American Girl. A lot of their facilities are now empty. And I think it did play such an important role in that community, and now it's not there, and it's really sad. We interviewed a former editor, Audrey Andrus, who writes children's books for girls, which are wonderful. And she was an editor at American Girl magazine, and she talked about that it's really sad for her that a lot of the facilities no longer exist. So I think for something that to me is iconically Midwestern, to it not have the footprint is really sad. And that's a loss that I feel.
And we have a question from our virtual audience. This is coming from Megan. Thank you so much. This was amazing. I wanted to say one of the books American Girl put out that I'm so thankful for as a girl growing up in the 2000s was The Care and Keeping of You. Do you know if American Girl is still putting out books about young girls' health?
Thank you for that question. Great question. Now, that was a really important book for me too. It was kind of the Our Bodies Ourselves for girls in the 90s who had questions about your period but didn't want to ask an adult. It had so much information about all different parts of life. And it was inspired in part because Pleasant was on a plane once reading the Wall Street Journal and saw an article about girls not having enough information about periods, and she literally took a pen and circled the article and wrote, "We need to address this," and handed it off to someone, and that's what inspired that book, which, has still lived on. But the book has kind of aged in the sense that it doesn't address the many complexities of girls' lives today, and the brand has tried to address that by actually issuing multiple books in their series it calls Smart Girls Guides. So it has a book on crushes, it has a book on like digital life and digital safety. What's kind of sad to me is that they did publish a book 2 years ago on body positivity, which I don't think is a controversial topic. I think it's inherent in us as adults to empower kids to feel good in their own skin, whatever that looks like. And it had a portion of the book which talked about if you have a crush on another girl, that's okay. And if you don't feel like a girl, that's okay. And you can find an adult you trust and talk to them about it. And after the book was published, a lot of conservatives boycotted American Girl, and instead of standing behind the book, which is researched and based on a lot of really important information, they pulled the book from their website. You can't buy it there anymore. You can buy it on Amazon, but you can't buy it on their website with the other Smart Girls Guides. And I think that's a real loss because, as the hope I've communicated this afternoon, I'm a big fan of this brand. I think they've had such an incredible influence in the ways they've empowered girls. And to take a step back from this, I think is a loss, and I hope that they change their mind.
Hi, I'm Courtney, and ironically, I'll be asking a question about Courtney.
Great.
Kind of jumping right off of that, talking about the apoliticalness of American Girl. I will out myself as someone who was not born in the 80s. And so I was just curious.
Brave.
My apologies.
You're so brave.
I was just curious your take with Courtney's book, since they deal so heavily with HIV and AIDS, kind of what you think American Girl was reflecting politically and what they chose to express in Courtney's book about HIV and AIDS.
Yeah, thank you for that question. First of all, this is like a funny aside, but they made a theme song for Courtney that's legitimately a banger called Hey Courtney, and those are the only lyrics, but it's incredible. Just want to flag that for everyone here if you need a fun moment in your life. But I think you're right that, I think the brand likes to say of itself, we don't get involved in politics. But of course, we're all involved in politics. Politics is about choices, it's about power. Everything we do is political. So for them to tell a story about the 80s, I was really interested to read the books because I wondered how they would handle the AIDS crisis. As a queer person, it's erasure from our national history is something that is important to me, and I try to redress. And it should be important for everybody, but they basically tell a story where her mom wants to be a mayor, and spoiler alert, doesn't win the election. But in the course of that, Courtney goes to school and literally watches the Challenger disaster on TV with her classmates, and has a classmate who has HIV through a blood transfusion, based largely on the story of Ryan White, a real child who became a national symbol for this. And trying to help the school change its policies which discriminated against him because parents were afraid, not knowing how AIDS were contracted, that he would be contagious. So it's based on real history about Ryan White, but I think we have to take into account why Ryan White's story is so seductive in the history of HIV/AIDS, which is that he's a white child and straight presenting, and he's a palatable story. He was in the time for people to understand that HIV/AIDS was really serious and it was not just a plague affecting gay people. I think that story is important. Ryan White's story is important, but it's not the only story of HIV/AIDS we could have told. And thinking again, like I said before, imagining how you would tell the story differently is a great way to approach a historical fiction text. I would have included a gay person who had HIV/AIDS, or a lesbian nurse who cared for HIV/AIDS, patients. That's a huge part of the history of HIV/AIDS that gets written out. There's queer women in that history too. Why not include gay people? And that's where I think about myself as a fan. As a young person, it would have meant the absolute world to me to read about a queer person in a book when I was a child, because I would have realized it wasn't strange or wrong or all these things I had in my head. So it's a major loss. I think it was a conservative choice. And while the books are entertaining, I just think, what if?
Hi. Sorry if this is a vague question, but I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on how American Girl addresses the sociocultural aspects of dress. Like not necessarily, fashion, but like how we adorn ourselves. Because I remember, that for me growing up looking at the catalogs and everything, and then now being somebody really interested in historical fashion, kind of like what, so how you, see how they've addressed it.
I love that question. I don't know that I'll have the best answer, but I think something that's, strikes me is that a lot of the stories they tell happen to be girls who are middle to upper class, so their clothes reflect that. There's not any girls like palling around in Oshkosh bagosh like I was, My grandmother actually made some of my clothes from patterns that she used to make my mom's clothes. So I was going to school in the 90s in like corduroy vest pant sets with turtlenecks that also smelled like her cigarettes that she didn't want me to know she smoked. So people at school were like, what time machine are you walking out of? But so I think you can read the fashion as like a really beautiful archive of the time, but of a certain moment, like of the people who could afford consumer clothes. That's what we're seeing in a lot of the historic choices. But I think kids' books are really interesting in that regard for having the flower sack dress that reflects the deprivations of the period and the ingenuity that came with that, of people using the cloth used to bind flour to then make clothing for their families, or cutting up the dad's clothes and remaking them as children's clothes. So I think that's interesting, but in terms of the clothes they sold for like girls who look like me, I'd have to go back and look, but it is interesting to think like, how do we see class in the 90s in those clothes? So that'd be a cool project, actually. Yeah, great question.
So I guess this also kind of deals with what stories you think are missing. So if you got to design or pitch like your own idea for Historical Girl, what kind of time frame and story would you come up with?
Oh my God. Oh my God. Thank you. Thank you for that. I needed that. So first of all, I would have a girl on the Titanic. That's for me. And yes, the Nellie book where she's on the Titanic, but I'm talking about like main character energy. She's there. She's calling out safety questions she has, like how come the guy up watching doesn't have binoculars? What's going down? Safety check. I'm also obsessed with utopian communities. So communities in American history where people were like, I think we have a different, better way of doing this, and we're gonna do it here, and you can join us, and it's all gonna be great. Spoiler alert, most of the time was not great, but the Shakers fascinate me. And so I would be doing a Shaker. Wow, oh my God. This like would only happen at a history center. Woo! I'm obsessed with the Shakers. I wrote my own Dear America that's about a Shaker. Yeah, Dear America was a gateway drug for me, I'm not gonna lie. Also hugely traumatic, but I think that would be key. I would also tell a story about a girl who's a loyalist in the American Revolution because, thank you, much more prevalent than you think. And I think I'm interested in people who are on the like less seductive part of an equation. So what's it mean when your whole family is like, no, being British is awesome. These people are brats. Like, just pay your taxes. It's not a big deal. We're part of the empire. Like, I think that would be fascinating. So those are the kind of stories that don't get told that I think would be more interesting. People in Dear America are obsessed with doing like girl perspectives from a Confederate. Nobody cares. We get that story. Leave it alone. Give us the Shaker. Give us Emily Dickinson's like imagined neighbor who sees too much and has a lot to say. That's what I'm into. Sorry if that's more than you bargained for. I think about this a lot.
My question is, so I'm the oldest in my family and I have two younger brothers and I was very into American Girl. But my brother had like a DIY doll. My mom bought like the Target one and gave him a bowl cut so that he could play along too. But they've officially added like a actual boy doll to the series. How do you feel about that as far as is it allow boys to engage with the girl being the protagonist, or is it taking away from what's special about American Girl? Like, what are your thoughts?
Ooh. Okay, this is a complicated question for me. I'm just gonna kind of go off the dome. Apologies in advance. But my mom and I were rocking around upstairs ahead of this, and I took a picture of my mom with the Girl Scout exhibit because my mom was the equivalent of an Eagle Scout for the Girl Scouts. Shout out to her. I never made it that far. I did get in trouble for falsifying my cookie sales and saying that my mom didn't want us selling to the neighbors, so she just bought some, and I put down like Louisa May Alcott, 2 boxes, because these were like my heroes. So on the one hand, I don't like the move to make Boy Scouts for girls too, because I don't like what I view as drawing away from Girl Scouts, which I think is actually a very inclusive, powerful organization. I support them. Not just loving their cookies, which I do. So in that sense, I think there's a time and a place for everything, but I think with American Girl, it costs us nothing to acknowledge that stories that are about acknowledging the importance of family and friends and feelings and acknowledging your past might be important for boys too. This brand was from a place that presumed that girls didn't have a space in the story. I think, it would be radical, if not vital, in our own moment, this is just my view, to say that for young kids, we need to be sharing a lot of the same values, that it's okay to feel feelings, that it's okay to have conflicts with people with whom you disagree, but you can navigate them without it being the end of the world, and that you can know about your own past, and even if you feel implicated in its poor choices, still live your life and not feel like it costs you anything to admit that maybe we would have done things differently had we lived in another time and had different choices. So all that to say, I think it's fine to have a boy and American Girl, and I wish boys had something like it, because I think it's really important, and I think the things we're offering kids now are lacking a lot of the things that make it so special. Did you have a question?
I did, actually. Well, first, my original question you stole. Very mean.
Wow.
I say that partially, when I went to design school, I started my own project in school to wanted to work for Mattel, so I was making my own American Girl doll, and I had a really hard time finding a period that they didn't already touch on. So I was gonna ask that question, but you already answered it, but I have another question.
Okay.
I'm not gonna state my opinion, but there's this phenomenon of people taking American Girl dolls and customizing them, and they wear crop tops and fishnets and put makeup on them and age them up. This is all over Instagram. It's people taking the dolls and giving them their own lifestyle. And when I was a young child, I would do that. And now looking back, I absolutely hate it. Do you have any opinion on this phenomenon?
Imagine if I was like, I think it's cool. I don't care what you think. Well, I think, it's sort of like dolls can become a Rorschach test. It's like they become what we need them to be. And I think for kids, I'm against kids growing up too soon. There's already too many things in life that make them confront things beyond their age. So I don't believe in that. And I will say that what has been really interesting is seeing this world of remixing dolls by adult fans to tell stories they wish existed in the brand. And I'm thinking specifically of queer folks, trans folks, disabled folks who want to see themselves reflected. So not necessarily just putting makeup on a doll, but I have a friend named Colette who runs the Inky Marina account. I'm gonna get her name wrong, the doll's name. But she's an indigenous person who remakes characters with her doll based on real indigenous history and offers education for basically white people on the internet who I can't believe do this, but create native characters, which is that's not for you, put that down. But she's an adult who's doing incredible work, and I've seen Harry Hill and others who are kind of having the fun and play that they maybe didn't have when it would have been age appropriate for them to be remaking dolls like that, because when you're young and you're a boy in the 80s or 90s, you think you're not supposed to do that. I actually had a guy come to another book event, and he was almost like this the whole time, hiding. And then he came up to me after, and he was like, I just have to say that I love these books and the dolls. And I brought my mom because she bought them for me when I was a child, and it was really moving. But so I agree. It's do I really want to see a Brat Summer American Girl doll? I don't know. But I mean, if that's doing something magical for someone and empowering, I guess we have to ask, who is it hurting? I think when it goes into appropriation, that's where I draw my line in the sand. But other than that, it's like, go off, I guess. But yeah.
Excellent. Well, we've reached our time for the Q&A, but let's give another round of applause for Mary Mahoney.
Thank you, everyone.